Beneath the surface of an unassuming neighborhood in Niagara Falls lies a story that changed the way America thinks about industry, public health, and environmental responsibility, as what was once envisioned as a cutting-edge development became one of the nation's most devastating environmental disasters, as a residential community was unknowingly built atop a chemical dumping ground. So how did this disaster unfold without anyone noticing until it was too late? What was the human cost of living on contaminated land? And how did this unfortunate event force a reckoning with how we handle toxic waste in the modern era? Stay tuned to find out, as today we uncover the story of the Love Canal Contamination Zone and why it's completely forbidden. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Our story today starts back in 1890, during the Second Industrial Revolution of the United States. Back then, a once railroad lawyer named William T. Love was looking for another outlet for his entrepreneurial spirit when he stumbled upon an opportunity around Niagara Falls, New York, or more specifically, the area located in the southeastern portion of the city, from around 93rd Street to 100th Street, side to side up to 103rd in the northeast direction, bounded by the Niagara River southward and the Burkholz Creek northward. Anyhow, in this area, he thought up what he coined as Model City, New York. This planned community would include residences, parks, and hydroelectricity. In 1892, Love also began to explore his idea for a shipping canal that would travel between the connected Lake Erie and Lake Ontario to his overall Model City project. Utilizing his financial knowledge, he devised that banks from New York City to England would support it enthusiastically. Thus, in October of the following year, the very first factory was opened in the vicinity. With the seeds of industry planted and many other manufacturers becoming interested in the area, by May of 1894, dig work began on the actual canal, and streets and residences were worked on at the same time. The future of the town was starting to come into focus, although Love could not have planned for what would happen next. You see, the panic of 1893 swooped in quickly, and with it, Love's hope for an industrial haven dissipated. This event was the most intense economic disaster in American history, all the way up until the Great Depression. So the panic was no joke for the people living back then. Hence, due to the economic downturn, many investors initially interested in Love's Model City pulled out completely. Not only did an economic downturn affect Love's plan, but so did lobbyists. Environmental groups approached Congress to advocate for a law preserving Niagara Falls. Under this legislation, no water could be removed from the site, thus disallowing any canal to be built should it direct the water flow in any other direction. Congress heeded their calls and passed the law in 1906. The canal project only saw 1 mile being dug north from Niagara River, and so it was. The Love Canal dig venture was ultimately abandoned completely. However, other plans still existed regarding introducing industries that could expand the area's economic potential, whether there was an active shipping canal or not. The Panic of 1907, and importantly, the rise of long-distance electrical transmission were the culprits behind ceasing these plans. You see, this invention made Love's plans for hydroelectric development completely obsolete, meaning the power that Love planned to harness in Model City could be accessed from bodies of water much further away. Ultimately, in 1910, any hope of Love's Model City was doomed, as his last piece of property was sold in auction after its foreclosure. At this point in the story, Love headed back to England, accepting defeat for factors that were mostly out of his control. From there, and throughout the early 20th century, Love pursued plans to create settlements in other locations, such as his plan to purchase 15,000 acres in Delaware in 1930. Whereas back in Niagara Falls, in what would have been Model City, the old, failed canal began to fill with water. And for the most part, it became a type of makeshift playground used by kids who wanted to entertain themselves by swimming and skating in the winters. However, with a rapidly growing city and industries that produce waste rising around the site, the Love Canal also found another purpose for those local endeavors. Unfortunately for the children's fun, the city also began using the canal as a dump site for industrial chemicals and municipal waste. In retrospect, this was the first time that those alarm bells should have been ringing in the officials' heads. Waste included materials from the local plastic, rubber, and abrasive industries. And it only got worse. Things began to shift in a new and even more worrisome direction as Hooker Chemical Company was granted permission by the Niagara Power and Development Company to dump their chemical waste into the Love Canal in 1942. Though I should note that only happened after draining and reinforcing their walls with a layer of protective clay. From there, they placed drums full of their chemical byproducts into the rut. In 1947, Hooker ended up purchasing the entire canal and its surrounding banks for themselves, thus permitting them to use the area to construct a whole 16-acre landfill. By 1952, Hooker had thrown a whopping total of 19,800 tons of chemicals into the dump site. In that year, the company realized that the site was likely going to be used as a construction site, so they stopped their operations. And to contain the chemicals already there, they proceeded to bury the drums 20 to 25 feet underground and then sealed the dump site with clay. And ultimately, the surface took on a seemingly standard appearance as vegetation returned and wildlife appeared. But here's the twist. Before the final closure occurred, the local Niagara Falls City School District had devised a plan to construct a school over the top of the old canal and sought to acquire the land needed to make such things happen. Furthermore, it's been alleged that it was only when the school board reached out to the chemical company in March of 1952 about potentially purchasing the land that they resolved to stop using the site as a dump, and that the corporation was thrilled by the solution as it potentially removed some liability regarding their dangerous chemical activities. Then, in April of 1953, Hooker sold the property to the school board for just $1 with a liability limitation clause that aimed to prevent any chemical-related lawsuits. Apparently, the $1 price tag was supposed to show the company's concern for the revitalization of the land. Since if the land were to be seized by a third party, such as the local government, the company would have been unable to communicate the dangerous chemicals under the property. Still, by selling it to the school board directly with this limited liability clause, they were able to speak openly about the dangers beneath the school. Even so, most believe that the buyers did not truly understand the level of hazard that they were coming into. Regardless, the school board pursued their plans to develop the land. After the school board officially came under the possession of where the Hooker dump site once was, they began constructing their planned school on top of it. And it didn't take long for workers to discover the extent of the danger below. By recommendation of the architect, they pivoted their construction site about 80 feet north to avoid any potential harm from the chemicals or the possibility of damage to their containment. By 1955, the 99th Street School was completed. This same year, the 93rd Street School was also opened only 6 blocks away, showing the rapid efforts towards developing the area after World War II. After the schools were constructed, the remaining land needed by the school board was sold away to residential developers. This is when the Niagara Falls Housing Authority constructed new homes alongside private developers. Hooker expressed concern at this point about the potential dangers that the housing development could introduce in the event that they would interfere with the sealed dump site. Even so, they decided to continue. Going beyond home construction, in 1957, Niagara Falls began constructing sewers in the area, and they penetrated the protective seal of the dump site in the process. They further destroyed the seal when they laid groundwater lines and the LaSalle Expressway, allowing rainwater to drain toxic waste from the site into the canal. Another side effect of this new construction was that the flow of groundwater was restricted by the expressway, not allowing drainage into the Niagara River. As the clay seal cracked over time and nobody kept watch of the status of the waste below, catastrophe crept ever closer. And gradually, the residents started to notice. But surprisingly, they kept living there. Into the 1970s, Love Canal was a proper community with a school, churches, shops, and residences occupied by working families. Overall, the town was a happy little corner of Niagara Falls. But that happiness was always supported by a degree of ignorance. An ignorance that would soon fade. At this point, most residents were still unaware of the chemicals in the canal, and even those who knew were unprepared for the extent revealed in the 1970s. As water poured down and fed into the ground, toxic chemicals were carried beneath and through the sewers, and they ended up in yards and basements of the locals, producing odd colors and fumes that people certainly should not be living around. Concern grew as community members saw odd-colored fluid flowing from the Love Canal and experienced unfamiliar odors and chemicals in their homes. It took an investigation by a local Niagara Falls newspaper, and then the truth was known, as the Niagara Falls Gazette investigated the high rate of local illness. Findings further confirmed by both corporate and government studies, which sampled air, soil, and water to get a full understanding of what was going on. It was found that carcinogens, such as benzene and highly toxic chemicals like dioxin, were working their way into residents' water and household air. The EPA also found that many residents of Love Canal exhibited early signs of leukemia and a 3,300% increase in the typical amount of chromosomal damage found in a population. Miscarriages were also on the rise, occurring at higher rates. People began to realize that the hazardous environment that they had been living in for years was jeopardizing their lives. They had to act fast. Throughout the late 1970s, as turmoil increased between environmental activists and officials who were not acting quickly enough, the federal government made its appearance to try and help alleviate the situation. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter declared a state of emergency for the community surrounding Love Canal, boosting an effort to relocate 239 families in the vicinity that were in the most extreme danger from the chemicals, and an attempt to contain the dangerous waste, protecting the rest. Despite this drastic effort towards rehabilitating a shattered community, nothing was enough. State findings revealed that more than 700 families around Love Canal were in danger of the toxins appearing in their homes. The relocation of 239 families was certainly a start, but it wasn't enough when considering how many people's lives could have been in danger. Activists at the time were not happy about any of this. This public outcry led to a second emergency, which Jimmy Carter declared again in 1980. This move established the Love Canal Emergency Declaration Area, or EDA for short, and it essentially defined 350 acres surrounding the landfill. This EDA was home to 7 different areas that the federal government provided funding to determine whether they were habitable. The move allowed for $20 million of federal money to help relocate displaced families. Notably, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, also appeared, opting to help facilitate the relocation process. Another valuable entity was also brought in. The New York state-formed Love Canal Area Revitalization Agency, and they worked in conjunction with FEMA. And just like that, in seemingly no time at all the evacuated residents were demolished by the year of 1982. And funny enough, the waste from those demolished homes was placed into the Love Canal landfill. As for the legislation influenced by the events at Love Canal, 1980 saw the signing of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or the Superfund law. The law aimed to coordinate the disposal of dangerous waste across the United States. In other words, the site of the disaster at Love Canal was the first Superfund entry on their national priorities list in September of 1983. Meaning that they received priority in terms of funds and efforts towards environmental improvement. Also, in conjunction with the amendments to the Superfund law in 1986, the EPA acquired the rights to manage the property and investigate the habitability of the emergency declaration area surrounding the canal. Furthermore, the EPA pursued the Love Canal Emergency Declaration Area Habitability Study in 1988. This widespread study saw 5 years of sampling around Niagara Falls to test habitability and contamination. Some areas were deemed safe for living, whereas others were zoned only for residential or industrial use. After surveying the contaminated areas, the EPA followed a series of steps alongside New York's agency to create a livable environment. The first step was to contain the landfill, collect unsafe water, and dispose of the waste. They introduced a polyethylene cover for the material and opened a new treatment facility for the water in 1985. The second step was to examine material that had been dug up and treat the sediment of the local sewers and creeks for decontamination and protection of the soil against further erosion. This process lasted all the way through 1987. The third step saw the cleanup surrounding the 93rd Street School, a step completed by 1992. Although finally, the Love Canal Agency would come under possession of this land as well and repurpose it for a community sports field. Finally, The last step in the EPA's plan was to coordinate the control of the properties, providing ultimate restoration of the residences and commercial areas. All of these cleanup efforts were wrapped up completely by 1999. Ultimately, the entire area has now been deemed safe for those living there, as well as those who are simply passing through. Despite the cleanup efforts and relocation projects being a massive American triumph, there's still room for consideration of other potential dangers. It's been said that there could be hundreds of these ticking time bombs nationwide. Since the harrowing events at the Love Canal in Niagara Falls, New York, the EPA has made efforts to provide legal scaffolding to protect Americans from situations that could match the ones we have observed today. Such legislation includes the Safe Drinking Water Act, Pesticide Act, and the Toxic Substance Control Act. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act also aims to provide a plan to help states dispose of harmful byproducts, since when dealing with unstable material, it can be very difficult to predict the future. We'll leave it there for today, but if you enjoyed this story, I recommend you check out our episode on New Jersey's radioactive contamination zone by clicking right here. This one is going to freak you out. Otherwise, you could click there to support me on Patreon and perhaps buy me a cup of tea. Until next time, as always, this is Ryan Sokash signing off.